The summer sun was already brutal at 6 in the morning when Thomas Miller walked out to his dairy barn in rural Wisconsin, 1938. He had 24 Holstein cows that needed milking, and he had maybe 4 hours before the heat would turn every gallon of fresh milk into a bacterial nightmare that could make his family sick and destroy his income for the day. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was survival. And Thomas, like thousands of dairy farmers across America before rural electrification reached their farms, had to rely on methods that were part science, part desperation, and entirely dependent on understanding how nature itself could become your refrigerator if you knew what you were doing. The problem was simple, but devastating. Fresh milk starts going bad the moment it leaves the cow. Bacteria multiply exponentially in warm temperatures. At 85 degrees, which was a typical summer day in the Midwest, milk could spoil in less than 2 hours. And spoiled milk meant more than just waste. It meant lost income at a time when dairy farmers were already struggling through the tail end of the Depression. It meant your children might not have safe milk to drink. It meant the cream you were planning to sell to the creamery would be rejected, and you'd be out the money you needed for seed or medicine or the mortgage payment that was already overdue. The stakes were that high every single day all summer long. Thomas finished the morning milking and looked at the 10-gallon can sitting in his barn. The milk was still cold from the cow's body temperature, around 100 degrees, which meant he had a narrow window to get it cooled down before the summer heat did its work. He grabbed the first can, hoisted its 80-pound weight onto his shoulder, and started walking. Not toward his house, toward the spring. The spring house was the oldest and most reliable method dairy farmers had for keeping milk cold, and it worked because of something people today forget. Cold water stays cold. Springs that bubbled up from deep underground maintained temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees year-round, regardless of what the air temperature was doing above ground. Thomas's grandfather had built the spring house over their farm's natural spring back in 1885, and 3 generations of millers had depended on it every summer since. The structure itself was deceptively simple: stone walls 2 feet thick, a wooden roof covered with sod for insulation, and a constant flow of spring water running through a shallow trough built into the floor. Thomas set the milk can directly into the flowing water and felt the cold seep through the metal. The water level came up to about 2/3 of the can's height, which was critical. Too shallow, and the top of the milk stayed warm. Too deep, and the can could tip over and spill. He'd learned that lesson the hard way as a teenager, losing 8 gallons of milk to the overflow drain and earning himself a switching from his father. The spring water flowed in from one end of the spring house and out the other, carrying away the heat it absorbed from the milk cans. This continuous flow was what made the system work. If the water had been still, it would have gradually warmed up from the milk's heat. But fresh cold water kept replacing the warming water, maintaining that constant 45 to 55 degree temperature that kept bacteria in check. Thomas could keep milk safe for 36 to 48 hours this way, long enough to get it to the creamery, or for his wife Ellen to skim the cream and start making butter. But here's what the agricultural extension bulletins from that era don't fully convey. Maintaining a spring house was constant work. The water channel had to be kept clear of leaves, mud, and debris, or the flow would slow and the temperature would rise. The stone walls needed regular inspection for cracks where warm air could seep in. Moss and algae had to be scrubbed away before they clogged the drainage, and you had to know exactly how many cans your spring could handle. Thomas's spring produced about 5 gallons per minute, which was enough for his herd, but his neighbor Jacob Schneider had tried to expand his dairy operation without testing his spring's capacity first. His spring flow dropped to a trickle by mid-July, and he lost 3 days of milk production before he figured out he'd overtaxed his water source. Not every farm had a spring. Some families had to dig for their cold water, literally. 40 miles south of Thomas's farm, the Patterson family had built an ice house, and that required a completely different kind of preparation and labor. Every January, when the lakes and ponds froze thick enough to support a wagon, dairy farmers without springs would gather crews and spend weeks cutting ice. Ice harvest was dangerous, exhausting work that defined the rhythm of winter in dairy country. You'd wait until the ice measured at least 12 inches thick, preferably 16. Thinner than that and you risked falling through. Farmers would mark off sections with ice saws, big two-man crosscut saws with teeth designed to cut through frozen water. The blocks were typically cut 22 inches by 32 inches, weighing anywhere from 75 to 150 pounds depending on thickness. Young men would use ice tongs to drag the blocks to shore, load them onto sleighs, and haul them to the ice house. The ice house itself was an engineering marvel disguised as a simple farm building. The Patterson's ice house was built into the north side of a hill for natural insulation. The walls were double thickness, an outer wall of rough-cut lumber, a foot-wide gap filled with sawdust, then an inner wall. The roof had the same double construction with sawdust insulation. The floor was dirt covered with sawdust about 6 inches deep. Every ice block got packed in sawdust on all sides as it was stacked, creating layers of ice and insulation that could keep the temperature near freezing even when it was 95 degrees outside. A well-built, well-packed ice house could preserve ice from January all the way through September, sometimes even into October. The Patterson family cut and stored about 40 tons of ice every winter, and that ice kept their milk cold, preserved their meat, and even let them make ice cream for the 4th of July. But it required brutal labor in freezing conditions, careful engineering, and constant maintenance. The sawdust had to stay dry. If water leaked in and wet the sawdust, its insulation value collapsed, and your ice melted faster. You had to monitor the drainage to make sure meltwater flowed out properly without washing away the sawdust. And you had to ration your ice use carefully, because once it was gone until next winter. The daily routine with an ice house meant taking ice blocks to the milk house morning and evening. The Pattersons had built a separate milk house, essentially a heavily insulated room, where they'd set their milk cans in wooden tubs and pack ice around them. The ice would melt gradually, and they'd drain the water and add more ice to maintain the cold. This worked, but it was labor-intensive and ice-intensive. A single 10-gallon can might need 20 to 30 pounds of ice twice a day in peak summer heat. For a farm producing 60 to 80 gallons daily, you were using hundreds of pounds of ice every week. Then there were the farms that had neither springs nor access to harvestable ice. These families turned to evaporative cooling, a method that sounds almost primitive until you understand the physics behind it and see how effective it could be in the right conditions. Sarah Mitchell ran a small dairy operation in western Nebraska, where springs were rare and winters sometimes didn't get cold enough for reliable ice harvest. She used what locals called a cooling cupboard, and it saved her operation during the drought years of the 1930s. The basic principle of evaporative cooling is straightforward. When water evaporates, it absorbs heat. Sarah's cooling cupboard was a wooden cabinet with slatted sides covered in burlap. She'd place her milk cans inside, drape wet burlap over the whole structure, and set the cabinet in a shady spot where the wind could blow through. As the burlap dried, the evaporation would pull heat out of the air inside the cabinet, dropping the temperature by 10 to 20 degrees below the outside air temperature. In dry climates like Nebraska's, where humidity was low and evaporation was rapid, this method could keep milk safe through the heat of the day. But evaporative cooling required constant attention. The burlap had to stay wet, which meant Sarah or one of her daughters had to pour water over the cabinet every couple of hours. If the burlap dried out completely, the cooling stopped and the temperature inside would spike. If the wind died down, the moist air around the cabinet would become saturated and evaporation would slow. Sarah learned to position her cooling cupboard to catch the prevailing southwest breeze and to keep a bucket of well water nearby for regular soaking. She also learned the hard way that evaporative cooling doesn't work in humid climates. Her sister tried the same method in eastern Kentucky, where summer humidity often topped 80%, and it was nearly useless. What's remarkable about all these methods is how they required farmers to become amateur scientists without ever calling it that. You had to understand thermodynamics, how heat transferred through different materials, how water absorbed and carried heat away, how insulation worked. You had to understand hydrology, how springs flowed, where to dig for reliable water, how to maintain consistent water movement. You had to understand meteorology, how temperature and humidity affected evaporation, how wind patterns changed throughout the day, how to predict when a heat wave was coming so you could prepare extra ice or increase your water flow. And you had to understand microbiology even if you didn't call it that. Farmers knew that warm milk turned sour, but the best dairy farmers understood the timing. They knew that fresh milk straight from the cow had natural properties that inhibited bacterial growth for the first hour or so. They knew that milk had to be strained immediately to remove particles that would harbor bacteria. They knew that every piece of equipment that touched the milk had to be scalded clean with boiling water, because residue from previous milkings would seed new bacterial growth. They knew that cream rose to the top, not just because it was lighter, but because it contained different bacterial populations that affected how quickly it spoiled versus the skim milk below. The Agricultural Extension Services and land-grant universities were publishing bulletins about these methods, but most of the knowledge got passed down through community networks. Thomas Miller learned his springhouse techniques from his grandfather. Sarah Mitchell learned evaporative cooling from a neighbor who'd moved west from Oklahoma. The Pattersons learned icehouse construction from a German immigrant family who'd been building them for generations in the old country. Rural communities functioned as knowledge networks where successful techniques spread from farm to farm through demonstration, conversation, and sometimes desperate necessity when a farmer's existing method failed. Competition between neighboring farms was real, but collaboration was essential. When Jacob Schneider's spring failed that July, Thomas Miller let him use his springhouse for 2 weeks, while Jacob dug a new, deeper channel to tap into a stronger water source. When the Patterson family lost half their ice supply to an early thaw in March of 1941, 3 neighboring families shared their ice so the Pattersons could make it through summer. And when Sarah Mitchell's cooling cupboard saved her milk during the 1936 heat wave that topped 110 degrees for 12 straight days, she spent the following spring teaching her method to 6 other farm families at a gathering organized by the county extension agent. The technology kept evolving within these constraints. Some farmers built what they called milk houses, separate structures designed specifically for cooling and storing milk that combined multiple methods. These buildings would have thick, insulated walls, north-facing windows for limited light that didn't generate heat, and often incorporated running water from springs or wells. Inside, you might have a combination of a spring-fed cooling trough, space for ice storage, and evaporative cooling equipment for backup. The most sophisticated milk houses had multiple rooms, one for receiving and cooling the fresh milk, one for storage, and one for processing butter and cheese. The cream separator was another crucial piece of technology that affected how farmers dealt with summer heat. These hand-cranked machines used centrifugal force to separate cream from milk, and they changed the economics and logistics of dairy farming. Before separators became common in the 1900s and 1910s, farmers had to let milk sit in shallow pans for 12 to 24 hours while cream rose to the top naturally. In summer heat, this was asking for spoilage. Separators let you process fresh milk immediately, and since cream was more valuable than skim milk and took up less volume, you could focus your cooling efforts on the cream while using the skim milk right away for feeding calves and pigs. This meant less total refrigeration capacity needed, which was critical for farms with limited spring flow or ice supplies. The economics drove everything. A gallon of whole milk in 1935 might bring a farmer 8 to 12 cents at the creamery. A gallon of cream could bring 60 to 80 cents. That difference was enormous when you were trying to keep a farm viable during the Depression. But spoiled milk brought exactly 0 cents, and worse, it could get you rejected by the creamery, which might refuse to take your milk for weeks if you'd sent them bad product. Your reputation mattered. Creameries and cheese factories depended on farmers delivering high-quality milk, and they rewarded reliable suppliers with better prices and guaranteed pickup. A farmer known for sending spoiled milk would find himself without a buyer. The health stakes were just as high as the economic ones. Before pasteurization became widespread in the 1920s and 30s, and even after that in rural areas where raw milk consumption remained common, contaminated milk was a serious health threat. Tuberculosis, brucellosis, and typhoid fever could all be transmitted through milk from infected cows or through bacterial contamination after milking. Families drinking their own farm's milk were constantly at risk if they didn't maintain proper cooling and sanitation. Many rural mothers followed strict rules. Never drink milk that's been warm for more than an hour. Never use milk that smells even slightly off, and when in doubt, boil it first. The children often got pulled into these daily routines, and their labor was essential. On Thomas Miller's farm, his 3 daughters rotated the job of walking milk cans to the spring house morning and evening. It was heavy work for girls aged 8, 11, and 13, but it had to be done. On the Patterson farm, the 2 boys spent January and February helping with ice harvest, learning the skill that might save their own dairy operations someday. Sarah Mitchell's daughter learned to judge by touch whether the burlap on their cooling cupboard needed more water, developing an instinct that let her keep the milk safe even when she was managing other chores at the same time. This knowledge transfer from generation to generation was how rural America preserved these techniques. But it was also fragile. If a farm family moved to town, that knowledge could be lost. If a farmer died without teaching his methods to his children, neighbors might struggle to replicate what he'd done. The Agricultural Extension Services tried to document everything in bulletins and pamphlets, but printed instructions could never fully capture the practice judgment that came from years of daily work. You couldn't learn from a bulletin how spring water felt when it was flowing at optimal rate versus slowing down. You couldn't learn from a pamphlet exactly how tight to pack sawdust around ice blocks for maximum preservation. That knowledge lived in hands and instincts. The arrival of rural electrification changed everything, but it happened gradually and unevenly across America. The Tennessee Valley Authority began bringing power to rural areas in the 1930s. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935, accelerated the process. But even by 1950, about 40% of American farms still had no electricity. Farmers in remote areas on poor quality land or in regions where utility companies saw no profit in running lines had to maintain their pre-electric cooling methods into the 1950s and even 60s. When electricity finally arrived on a farm, the first major purchase was usually a refrigerator, but it was rarely a household refrigerator. Most dairy farmers bought or built a milk cooler first, a large refrigerated unit that could hold multiple 10-gallon cans and chill them quickly to the safe temperature of 40 degrees or below. These early electric coolers were expensive, often costing more than a year's profit from the dairy herd, so farmers had to make a calculation about whether the investment would pay off through reduced milk loss and better prices for higher quality milk. Many farmers financed these purchases through cooperatives or farm credit programs, betting their farm's future on the promise of electric cooling. But even after electrification, the old methods didn't disappear immediately. Power outages were common in rural areas, especially during summer storms when you most needed cooling. Smart farmers maintained their spring houses or ice houses as backup systems. Thomas Miller got electricity in 1948, bought a milk cooler in 1949, but kept his spring house in good working order until he retired in 1964. He'd survived 2 major power outages during that time, once for 3 days during a summer storm, and his spring house had saved his milk production both times. The transition period created interesting hybrid systems. Some farms would use electric coolers to do the initial rapid chilling, then transfer the milk to spring houses or ice houses for longer-term storage, saving electricity costs. Others used electric coolers for their cream, which was the most valuable product, and continued using traditional methods for skim milk and whole milk they'd use themselves or feed to animals. The adaptation showed the practical wisdom of farmers who'd learned not to depend entirely on any single system because every system could fail. There's something profound in understanding how much labor and knowledge went into the simple act of keeping milk cold for a day. Modern consumers turn on a refrigerator and expect it to work. The connection between electricity, compressors, refrigerants, and cold is invisible and taken for granted. But farmers before electrification had to maintain an intimate relationship with temperature, water, insulation, and the bacterial processes that determined whether their product stayed safe or spoiled. They couldn't afford ignorance or carelessness. Every gallon of milk represented feed costs, labor costs, and the genetic investment in building a productive dairy herd. Losing that milk to heat wasn't just wasteful. It was a direct threat to the farm's survival. The methods also created a rhythm to daily life that's hard to appreciate now. Your day was structured around milk cooling as much as around milking itself. You couldn't just finish milking and move on to other work. You had to walk those cans to the spring house, monitor the ice supply, wet down the burlap, check the water flow. You had to plan your day around the heat, doing fieldwork in the cooler morning hours, and being present at the farm during peak afternoon temperatures when milk was most vulnerable. You couldn't take a day off during summer because the milk didn't stop coming and the heat didn't stop threatening it. Seasonal variation shaped everything. Winter was relatively easy because the whole world became your refrigerator. You could set milk cans on the porch in January and they'd stay cold for days. But summer demanded constant vigilance. Spring and fall were transition periods where you had to judge day by day whether you needed full cooling or could relax your efforts. Farmers developed an instinctive sense of temperature and its relationship to milk safety, often waking in the night during heat waves to check on their cooling systems. The social dynamics around these methods created bonds and hierarchies within rural communities. Farmers with reliable springs had status and were considered fortunate. Families with well-built ice houses were respected for their foresight and labor investment. Those who struggled with marginal cooling systems were often the first to fail during hard times, and neighbors watched these struggles with a mixture of sympathy and judgment. Could they have planned better, worked harder, learned more? The line between bad luck and poor management was often debated when a farm went under. Gender roles around milk cooling were complex and varied by family. Milking itself was usually men's work on larger farms, but women often managed the cooling and processing. Farm wives were responsible for the spring house or milk house in many operations, monitoring temperatures, managing ice supplies, and deciding when milk was safe to use versus needing to be discarded. Women also typically handled butter and cheese making, which required its own cooling and storage considerations. The farm wife's judgment about milk quality directly affected family income and health, giving her real authority even in patriarchal rural structures. Children's participation wasn't optional. Farm families needed every set of hands, and children as young as 5 or 6 would be assigned tasks related to milk cooling, fetching water, checking temperatures, monitoring equipment. This was how knowledge transferred between generations, not through formal teaching, but through daily participation in essential work. Kids learned by watching, by making mistakes, by gradually taking on more responsibility. A teenager who could manage a spring house or ice house operation solo was demonstrating readiness for adult responsibilities. The equipment itself embodied accumulated wisdom. A well-designed spring house had features that weren't obvious. The water trough was built at a specific depth and angle. The overflow was positioned to prevent backflow. The stone walls had drainage channels to handle condensation. The door faced away from prevailing winds. These design elements came from generations of refinement, each feature solving a problem someone had encountered. Similarly, ice house construction incorporated lessons learned from failures. The tragedy of ice houses that collapsed under weight, the waste of ice that melted too quickly because of inadequate insulation, the losses from drainage systems that failed. Weather extremes tested every system. The heat wave of 1936, where temperatures topped 100 degrees across the Midwest for weeks, pushed cooling methods to their limits. Springs that normally flowed abundantly slowed to trickles as water tables dropped. Ice supplies melted faster than anyone had anticipated. Evaporative cooling became less effective, as even Nebraska's dry air carried more moisture. Farmers lost milk, lost income, and some lost their farms entirely when they couldn't meet their financial obligations after weeks of reduced production. Droughts created cascading problems. Less rainfall meant lower water tables, which meant slower spring flows and less ice available from shallow ponds and streams. The Dust Bowl years of the 1930s tested dairy farmers across the Great Plains, forcing innovations in water conservation and cooling efficiency. Some farmers dug deeper wells, investing in windmills to pump water for cooling troughs. Others abandoned dairy farming entirely for livestock that needed less intensive cooling systems. Winter failures were equally devastating in their own way. A warm winter meant thin ice that couldn't be harvested safely, leaving farms without their crucial summer cooling supply. The winter of 1931 to 32 was unusually warm across much of the Midwest, and by July, Farms with ice houses were running out of ice months earlier than expected. Some farmers tried buying ice from commercial ice plants, but the cost was prohibitive for daily milk cooling. Others slaughtered parts of their dairy herds because they couldn't maintain milk quality without adequate cooling. The end of the pre-electric era happened at different times in different places, creating a 20-year period from roughly 1945 to 1965, where some farms had electric cooling while neighbors were still using springs and ice. This created interesting market dynamics. Farms with electric cooling could offer better quality control and longer storage times, potentially getting better prices, but they also had higher operating costs and debt from equipment purchases. The traditional methods were labor-intensive, but largely free after the initial infrastructure investment. Whether modernization made economic sense depended on herd size, market access, and the farmer's age and outlook. There was sometimes tension between generations during this transition. Older farmers who'd successfully used traditional methods for decades questioned whether electric cooling justified its costs. Younger farmers eager to modernize sometimes clashed with parents or older siblings who resisted change. These weren't just arguments about technology, they were arguments about risk, debt, tradition, and competing visions of what farming should be. Some families split operations, with the older generation maintaining their springhouse, while a younger family member invested in electric cooling on newly cleared land. The knowledge of pre-electric cooling methods began disappearing almost as soon as it became unnecessary. By the 1970s, very few American farms were still using spring houses, ice houses, or evaporative cooling as primary milk storage methods. The skills involved in building and maintaining these systems stopped being passed to new generations. Agricultural extension services stopped publishing bulletins about ice harvest or spring maintenance. The living memory of how these systems worked became concentrated in elderly farmers, and as they died, much of the practical detail died with them. What remains are the structures themselves, scattered across rural America. Stone spring houses still stand on old farmsteads, though many are crumbling or have been converted to storage sheds. Ice houses are rarer, often torn down for their lumber or collapsed from neglect. The traces are there for anyone who knows what to look for. The channeled stone where spring water once flowed, the deep sawdust pits where ice was stored, the north-facing hillside locations chosen for natural cooling. These remnants are monuments to human ingenuity and the daily labor that sustained rural America before electricity made cold convenient instead of earned. Understanding these methods matters because it reveals how recently our food system operated on completely different principles. The distance from farm to table was much shorter when milk had to be consumed within days of production. The seasonal variation in dairy product availability was much greater when cooling capacity expanded and contracted with weather and ice supplies. The direct connection between farmer labor and product quality was immediate and unforgiving. These realities shaped rural culture, family structures, community relationships, and the economics of American agriculture in ways that reverberate even now, long after the spring houses have gone dry and the ice houses have emptied. The farmers who kept milk cold without electricity weren't doing something quaint or primitive. They were applying sophisticated understanding of physics, hydrology, microbiology, and engineering to solve a critical problem with the resources available to them. Their success sustained America's dairy industry through periods when that industry was essential to both rural prosperity and national nutrition. Their methods worked reliably enough that millions of families drank safe milk every day. Butter and cheese production continued year-round, and dairy farming remained viable even in the remotest regions. That's not nostalgia. That's genuine achievement worthy of understanding and respect. The transition to electric cooling was progress, undeniably. It reduced labor, increased reliability, and enabled the expansion of dairy production that helped feed growing cities. But something was also lost: the intimate knowledge of natural processes, the community bonds formed through shared challenges and mutual aid, the satisfaction of solving complex problems with elegant simplicity. The farmers who lived through this transition often spoke of both relief at the easier work and a certain wistfulness for the old competencies that no longer mattered. Today, If the power grid failed for an extended period, very few farmers would know how to keep milk cold without electricity. The infrastructure is gone, the skills are gone, and even the understanding that such methods existed is fading. This isn't an argument for rejecting modern technology. It's a recognition that every advance comes with costs in lost knowledge and capabilities. The farmers who kept milk cold in summer before electricity possessed expertise that modern farming has no use for. But that expertise represented centuries of accumulated human understanding about working with nature rather than against it. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this look into America's agricultural past interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with anyone who appreciates the ingenuity and hard work of the farmers who built this country's rural traditions. This video is inspired by real historical facts and the authentic experiences of American dairy farmers from the 1930s through the 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or communities. Thomas Miller is a representative character reflecting the real experiences of hundreds of American dairy farmers who faced similar challenges keeping their milk cold during the summer months before rural electrification reached their farms. These men and women developed and maintained sophisticated cooling systems through knowledge, labor, and community cooperation, sustaining America's dairy industry through some of the most challenging decades in agricultural history.